I'll get back to CG in a moment. CO, guys present.
CO are here.
All right. Checking again for CG. Not too sure if CG is here. Let me have a look at chat. Oh, okay, CG is here. Fantastic. Hi everybody, my name is Jason. I shall be the chair for a round. I should have a panelist with me. May the panelist introduce himself to the crowd, to the room.
Okay, yeah. Good evening, everyone. Manuel here. Let's have an awesome time. Good luck to all.
All right. Yeah, without further ado, for the proceedings of this Masters round, I would like to invite the Honorable Prime Minister. Here.
All right, could you please confirm, am I audible?
Yep, loud and clear.
All right, thank you so much for the confirmation. We'll start in a few seconds. Just need to check for my timer. All right. I'll start with my first word. Imagine a world in which there are social media companies that have the liberty and the right to go ahead and make the decisions on who gets to speak in a social media platform, at what point in time, about what topics. They don't only get to censor your speech, they also get to kick you out of the platform if you talk about something that they don't like. Now, let us do a little bit of actor analysis. What does it mean when I say that a social media company doesn't necessarily like what you're saying? It means then that above and beyond whatever you have to put forward, they can utilize the sort of guidelines that they have, which are to a far greater degree vague, let us imagine, on that point in time. They are likely to go ahead and make it a reason for why you are probably not being the best person or the best discussion originator, initiator within the community. And the reason is because you're probably talking about something that you necessarily think is important to have a conversation about. But what they think is that your conversation is probably going ahead and making them feel like, making other people feel like threatened, or making other people feel like you're being insensitive towards a particular discussion or something. And they can utilize this particular ruse to throw you out of a particular platform. Why is this essentially a bigger problem on our side of the paradigm, and why do we think that we need to have a ban on this particular structure? The biggest issue with regards to this is that this goes ahead and constricts or blocks the entire process of how we go ahead and put forward our democratic values and how we run an entire construct of a democratic government in status quo. Why is that so? Let us talk about why the absolute ban structure is necessary in this particular regard. Think about the sort of leverage that a social media company is able to go ahead and garner in this particular regard, primarily because of the fact that they might have ties to, let us say, political parties that have the capacity of ruling the nation to a degree, or are probably already ruling the nation and don't necessarily want to go ahead and hear constructive criticism or criticism of any sort based on the things that they might be doing wrong. This is a very good way to go ahead and make sure that people who are already in bubble audiences stay in bubble audiences, and make sure that they don't have to escape out of their own echo chamber, so that they don't have to go ahead and listen to somebody else's differing opinion. What does that mean? It means that to a far greater degree, there's a greater capacity for these social media organizations to actually make sure that your voter base stays the same manipulated as it is, to the point that they are able to make only one choice, and that is the choice to go ahead and reinstate the ruling party, because all they get to see are the positives of what the government is doing, or all they get to see are a wrapped image of what essentially needs to be put forward in front of them to make them feel like the decision that they are making is probably one of the best decisions altogether, as opposed to seeing the truth for what it is. And this is something that can very easily be accessed at any point in time if these social media organizations have the capacity to kick out people left, right, and center. Because number one, if they go ahead and do so, it is very hard for you to go ahead and actually fight against it. It is very hard for you to go ahead and point out specific reasons for why that is wrong, because they have the capacity to shape and name the guidelines.
Why?
Their guidelines are broad to the point that they are able to utilize the umbrella of that guideline to make sure that you're probably not included at any point in time. But most importantly, this also probably ensures that you are defamed to a far greater degree, because they can then warp or twist the narrative for why they think that people had complained with regards to the way that you have put forward your words or your text in front of the community. I think this becomes a very amazing ruse then for these social media organizations to exploit without any sort of a disciplinary factor, without any sort of a restrictive or punitive measure existing in the first place. I think that is why the policy that we have from our side of the paradigm goes ahead and talks about three things. Number one, if you actually face something or feel something is off by the way that somebody is speaking on social media, especially if it is a
Closing.
political party or a representative of a political party who has, like, let's say, a stronghold or a capacity to go ahead and make tangible change or tangible impact with their words, then the structure should be to go ahead and put forward whatever they have said in a public forum in front of some sort of a court, some sort of a law enforcing authority that then has the right and the liberty to go ahead and decide whether this is the sort of discussion that we are supposed to go ahead and propagate on a social media platform. And then you're supposed to go ahead and prosecute the same with regards to whether the law enforcement authority thinks that this is reason or strike enough for this particular individual to now go ahead and be pushed out of the entire social media, or for this person to be curbed from having the capacity to speak in that social media. Why do we think that the inclusion of judiciary in general is something that's a feasible, be practical, and c, most importantly, principally viable? I think the feasibility of it is because of the fact that there's a greater amount of punitive measure that judiciaries hold. There's a lesser likelihood for judiciary to go ahead and be inherently corrupt to a far greater degree, which means then the number of loopholes that are there make sure that the people or the common mass also has the capacity to be away from the entire crowd of bubble audiences, and would probably get the split difference of what is essentially happening. Because if somebody goes ahead and says something that, let's say, other people don't like, but then is put forward in front of, let's say, a court of law or some sort of an enforcement authority that is then able to go ahead and prosecute that, or maybe go ahead and engage into it, or see if into it if that is something that is, let's say, unconstitutional or unparliamentary to a far greater degree, then they have the capacity to go ahead and create ripples. They have the capacity to go ahead and create discussions around the same, which is what we essentially require for a far greater point in time in this particular regard. But most importantly, then, not just about the feasibility and practicality of it, but about the reason why this is principally more viable. I think it is extremely important that these capacities be provided to the stakeholders within the nation itself, as opposed to going ahead and just trying to make sure that it's a decision from an organization that might have a certain amount of bias being played out towards a particular organization or a particular authority, because that then itself undermines the entire sense of democracy. Before I move forward, POI closing. 3, 2, 1.
Okay.
Moving on then.
Car. The clarity from my side that I need to know is what's the policy and how it changes the problem. I really don't care about the problem. I just want to know how you change the problem.
All right, very simple way, reiterating the same, put forward the same concerns in front of a judicial authority and make sure that the judicial authority actually goes through with it in a public capacity, so that you're able to keep this clean in front of everybody who is a stakeholder, in front of the nation at large, that this is something that should not have been stated in front of a social media, let's say, in front of, like, let's say, public as a whole. And this is something that necessarily needs to be taken into consideration as an unparliamentary or something that's problematic to state in, like, let's say, a capacity of a public person or a famous person or somebody as a representative of a political party. Make the process seem more seamless and transparent to a far greater degree, as opposed to what we get at any point in time on the current side of the paradigm that we have. I think this is something that is extremely important, because the democratic infrastructure heavily relies on the entire construct of trust and capacity building that we are able to push at any point in time. And this reinstates and actually safeguards the entire crux of democracy that we want to talk about at any point in time in the status quo. With that, proud to propose.
All right, I thank the Prime Minister for this amazing speech. Now inviting the Leader of Opposition. Here.
Okay, cool. I'm just checking if I'm audible.
Yep, loud and clear. Ready when you are.
Okay, cool. So I'll be starting my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Panel, if opening government is going to talk to you about the protection of democracy, then our stance is clearly a winning stance, because I think that the greater principle that we ought to be having a conversation about is one of protection in light of volatile political messaging, in light of volatile political dynamics. Let's have a conversation real quickly about when exactly do social media companies actually deplatform politicians, right? Because it isn't the way that opening government is currently characterizing to you, where there's this weird power play structure that social media companies are using in order to exploit certain politicians in order to favor current governments. And why is that so? Because, first of all, social media companies are independent entities that go ahead and function independently, even if they have political incentives, right, in order to co-opt current governments for whatever perverse incentives they have. It is unlikely that it is done through a lens of loyalty, because so on and so forth, they can go ahead and get those same political benefits from anyone that they decide to side to. They don't have that active incentive to go ahead and push out opposition, and so PM is practically out of the debate. But then secondly, they don't necessarily want to keep people in these echo chambers, because that's counterintuitive to the way social media works and the way that social media companies practically earn their profit. They earn their profit through high engagement. You get high engagement through high levels of engagement from people of different sides of the political spectrum actually engaging in discourse on social media platforms, meaning that they don't have the incentive to go ahead and just push out politicians for the sake of pushing them out, just because they have polarizing ideas to that of whatever they believe in. That is a lie. What is the truth? I think the truth is that we do have instances where politics can become volatile. Let's look at what happened on the 6th of January, where there was like that huge Capitol violence incident within Washington, right? That forced Twitter to genuinely ban Donald Trump for inciting violence that had mass repercussions, not just on the people of Washington, not just within the United States, but on the globe in and of itself. That genuinely shifted the way people could engage, not just with politics, but with life,
Why?
with safety, with circumstances. I think that that is an act, that those are specific circumstances in which like social media platforms have the active incentive and obligation to genuinely deplatform politicians. So the debate can't necessarily just be about, oh no, guys, we are just going to ban people for the sake of politics. It needs to be about, what do we genuinely do with individuals that are politicians, that have this power and influence over society to mobilize it in either good ways or very dangerous ways? How do we practically deal with it? And why do we defend the ban? First of all, I already tell you that social media
Yeah,
companies practically are independent platforms. That is to say, they are not arms of the state in majority of the instances. It's not necessarily like China or North Korea, where they actively build up their own entities for social media. I think that the majority of the world has social media companies acting in their own independency, meaning that they have the economic right to go ahead and dictate what is on their platforms, because their platforms are their own intellectual property. I think that by virtue of them just being corporate entities, they should go ahead and have the right to dictate who should be on them, especially if they don't have that active political incentive to block out voices, but do have that active incentive to go ahead and stop violence. That is why there are community guidelines. That is why social media companies fold towards the pressure that is to make their platforms very safe. It also ties into this constitutional and community right to practically dictate their platforms. And why is this so? I think we need to understand that the nature of social media isn't that it's for the state, it's most of the time for the people. And I think that this is true within the age that we're seeing. It's why when we go ahead and pressure Facebook to have tighter controls on our information, or when we pressure Twitter to have tighter controls on safety, or when we take TikTok to like court and have like civil litigations against its protections for minors and so on and so forth, they genuinely fold because they have been co-opted as arms for people. So their obligation has to first be for people, and to ensure that the right of the community that they serve, of the people that they ought to go ahead and protect, are best protected. Before I continue with my case, POI from CG.
POI
3,
OG.
2. Okay, OG.
The problem is that there's still a chance and there's a degree of certainty that this can be used as a political weapon as opposed to going ahead and being used for something that is safeguarding the society. And that's the harm that we are talking about here.
So I think that we would rather have the harm of some politicians not necessarily being being able to speak on social media, as opposed to the harm of people dying by virtue of protected attributes like their nationality, by circumstances like xenophobic attacks, or by very crazy Trump followers that genuinely want to go ahead and burn capital structure, because the impacts on our side, or while the harms that you have on OG are so much worse than just us not necessarily having politicians speak on Twitter. Because here's the reality: just because they don't speak on Twitter doesn't mean that they're blocked out from media in and of itself. Because first of all, there's print media. You can still exist on cable TV, you can still go ahead and be called on like some sort of political commentary show and exist there. And why would we prefer that? Because first of all, it still allows you to exist in the political space and have your views like perpetuated, so that democracy can still be upheld to some extent within society. The thing is that those platforms are probably better and more appropriate because they don't have the potential to be as volatile as when you actually do things on social media. Because when you go to these other like traditional forms of media, first of all, they're better regulated and better controlled, so you don't have this volatility spewing outside because of how sanitized it is. In comparison to social media, that doesn't necessarily dictate what your post looks like, what your tweet looks like, and that only stops at removing that tweet or removing that post, as opposed to removing the individuals that have the ability to continuously make the space hostile and volatile. I think the comparative is simple. On our side, you still have politicians existing in the political spectrum and their ideas being out there. It's just that in our world, where you still have traditional media as an alternative, but you allow social media platforms to ban, you have the active space to ensure that the political spectrum is safe enough to be engaged with without the harm of genuinely having January 6th repeating. And with that, we are proud to oppose.
I thank LO for the amazing speech. Now inviting DPM. Here.
Hi, can you guys hear me? Am I audible?
Yep, loud and clear. Ready when you are.
Okay, okay. Fantastic. Put POIs in the chat space. I really hope you can do that because I'm looking at the chat space. Let me just set up my timer. While I do that, I'll just like give a quick shout out to the Vacation Sparse community. Hi everyone. If you were not able to sign up for this comp, you can watch this, and you can also check out the website for more information on future competitions. We'd be happy to host you today and beyond. Cool. That said, I'm gonna start on my next word. In an era where tech oligarchs control both political speech platforms and AI systems that interpret, amplify, and contextualize political information, we think if you allow these guys to independently deplatform anybody that they don't like, we think this is going to give them too much epistemic power, and they are going to consolidate this in a single private sector, and this is going to crumble the democracy as we know it. Panel, let's be very honest. Today's debate is not simply about any other social media platform. It's about the big powerhouses that we've seen do this in the past. We've seen Twitter do this. We've seen Facebook do this, right? We've seen Reddit do this, like externally with their community moderators. If they don't like your right-wing idea, they are going to simply ban you. This then means then that we are arguing from a place of reality check from opening government by seeing all of these excesses of abuse of power by Mark Zuckerberg and like Jack Dorsey when he was in charge of Twitter, by abusing the rights of these people and like just taking them off the platform whenever they wished to. That means like a large chunk of the things within the opposition tell you can simply be refuted by a reality check that would let you know that they have abused this power in the past. It's not all rosy like they say. What am I going to do? I'm going to respond to opening opposition and kick them out. Then I'm going to extend on the principles that the prime minister gives you. Note, first thing opening opposition says is that, well, they don't think that these particular platforms are bad guys because they don't want to ban you because their business model like operates on them having more engagement. I don't think this is true. I think like most times they take this decision by choosing which particular site they want to favor. So they can shadow ban you if they disagree with the things that you say because they know that the other side, which is the left wing or the right wing, would be so happy about the shadow banning that they are still going to get the engagement that they need anyways. But then also number two, when they say the social media firms are independent companies, I don't think this is true because for now you need to know that number one, most of these owners of these particular platforms get state subsidies through their tech initiatives because they have most times they have more than one wing than the social media company itself. But then also in 2025, we think like politics is so polarized that the tech CEOs are public political actors like Elon Musk, and sometimes they donate to the super PAC of these left-wing, right-wing political parties, and they are big-time ideological advocates. That means then that their platforms like Twitter now control speech platforms, they control the AI intermediaries, and they control ad infrastructure. Like the biggest hub for advertisement for the left-wing party in the last elections was literally through Facebook. That means then that it's not simply an independent like party or an independent like company anymore. This is a huge political tool that the state needs to pay attention to
POI.
in how to abuse power. Put POIs in the chat space. I'm looking, I want to take a verbal one. Then that means that if I engage the case that open opposition brings to you to say, well, this would be a violation of their rights because it's the rights of the people collectively to determine how their community should be. I don't think this is true. I think, panel, the state has a bigger right to regulate how things like town square operate because social media is the new age town square of the people in the democracy. Because insofar as everybody goes there to share their voices and they are big arbiters of political power and political reality, this then means then that if somebody wants to silence other people they don't agree with, we think the state has an obligation to make sure that they are forced to use the judiciary to prove if they have a valid reason to want to silence these particular people. But then the other thing open opposition says is that, well, banning from social media is not the end. You can use print media and TV. Number one is 2025. Even Fox News want to get traction on their Twitter handle. Nobody really watches TV that much unless you are 40, 45, 50 and you are retired. But then number two, these political parties are targeting Gen Z and newer generations who are chronically online. That means it's not really a case of saying, oh, let them do whatever they want on social media. They can still print. No, we think that the harm goes to Gen Zs that are chronically online. And you need to make sure you are protecting them by giving them the most available source of information without allowing Twitter to target anybody that they disagree with. Before I start my extensions, I'll take a POI from closing opposition. Shoot.
Okay, so Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama always post stuff against the Republicans who Elon Musk publicly supports. Why aren't their sites cancelled yet? Like the argument isn't making any logical consistency.
No, this is not a problem at all. Like if Elon Musk has not cancelled Hillary Clinton, that's because he hasn't gotten a big enough reason to do so. Like, do you get? But in the next election, if he thinks Hillary Clinton is going to be a bigger problem, you won't be surprised if he bans there at that time. Like when they feel you're a threat, that's when they decide to ban you. What we are saying from OG is that if he then decides to ban them, he needs to have a valid reason. He needs to take this issue to court and fight it. Like if they're not banning anybody, we are winning this debate anyway because it probably scared them into not banning more people very stupidly. The first justification why this policy needs to happen and why this curbing of right needs to happen is that panel notes that insofar as democracy needs to like only exist when people can only fulfill their political rights to its extremities, then we say that people need to have an access to all variety of information. That means then that the voters have a right to hear political actors and judge political actors by themselves. If you decide to ban someone, it means you're restricting their political rights. And in principle, the only actor that can restrict somebody's political rights is the state or at least an arm of the state through the judiciary. That doesn't mean then that our policy makes sense because the state would force like Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk to make sure they have a valid claim to say that maybe Trump did treason or Trump did something legally against the Constitution, that he can get a warrant to push Trump off of this town square that is now on the internet. We think that principle justification is why this policy is going to pass. We'll win on that. But then the second second thing I'm going to do is argue like a pragmatic. We think that most times there is a harm that has happened in status quo and in the past. When they banned Trump off of Twitter by doing it independently, what happened is that he simply founded another app called Truth Social, and he went on saying he's a martyr, and they banned him because they hate him. They banned him because he spoke the truth. Now, I don't know whether Trump is a bad guy or a good guy, but if you're going to have a genuine bad guy on your platform that you need to ban, if you ban them independently, on upside, what you would have is that there will be several instances where these guys are going to escalate radicalization because you allow them to control the narrative about why they didn't do some things and why you banned them and why you targeted them. These are all things that we can keep on our side because the prosecution is going to give a legal documented processes that the public can have access to know that, hey, you actually incited treason, you incited violence against the state. That's why they banned you. That means then that when they establish other forms of platforms like Truth Social and whatnot, these other platforms are not going to take off. You get to protect democracy better by owning the narrative and not doing things under the cover and stuff like that. The third extension I'm going to talk about is like the intro I gave you. Panel, look, in today's world, Twitter wants to use Grok to interpret their right-wing ideology reality. Facebook wants to use Meta AI to interpret the left-wing ideology. What happens on upside is that if they ban somebody independently, they can train this AI data to respond to the people how they want their response to be. So when somebody tags Grok and go like, why was person ABCD banned? Grok is going to say they were banned because they did 1, 2, 3 bad things, which probably are not true. That means the only way you can keep the excessive power that tech oligarchs are getting in the political sphere is to make sure that they don't get to use their AI to twist the reality of people when they decide to ban other people. Because Elon Musk can literally decide to target people from South Africa because he thinks there is a white genocide going on,
Time.
even if this is not true. Vote OG.
All right, thank you very much to the Deputy Prime Minister for the fine speech. Now, I would like to invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Here.
Hi guys, can you hear me?
Yep, loud and clear. Ready when you are.
All right, POI is in the chat. I'm looking at the chat. Do not unmute your mic for any reason whatsoever. I really want to take a POI, so just indicate in the chat if you do have a POI, and I will take you. I'm starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. There is a stalemate on the power abuse narrative in the top half so far. Opening government claims that social media platforms are gaining too much power and have a tendency to abuse that power. So when we allow them to independently deplatform, then they can be ridiculous. We think the same thing happens on their own side of the house. Because when you think about it, even government, politicians do have a ridiculous amount of power. I think there are a lot of missing narratives in the opening government claim. First, they want judicial inclusion. They don't explain why the judicial is not going to be as compromised as the state exists in status quo because of the way the power exists in those particular places. They don't answer all these key narratives, and I think it just makes it a little bit difficult for you to buy their claim. But let me reconcile the clash in the opening half and show you why we win. The first thing I want you to think about is the amount of power that politicians do have in status quo. This creates a balance on the power narrative since they want to invoke so much power on social media platforms. In status quo, politicians have ridiculously heavy amount of power. They have police power. They have legislative authority. They control the media. They have economic leverage. They have regulatory power over tech companies. This means that social media platforms have only one meaningful tool to keep politicians in check. This is important, given that all the other institutions that should keep politicians in check have failed, given that politicians have a ridiculous amount of power to override them. Like you see in the United States, with Trump controlling a huge part of the narratives that exist in status quo. But you see in developing countries, in third world countries, where they run a monopoly on the government structure, where government dictates what exactly should happen in this particular regard. This means that when you ban social media companies from the platforming, you take away the only democratic check on political power that exists outside state control or government power. This is important because Pinelle explains beautifully in the Elo speech that platforms, social media companies have proprietary rights and speech obligations. They are private properties, not public utilities.
which means that they do have the constitutional and economic right to decide what exists on their platform. Go back to when newspapers were doing the same thing. In like newspapers were never required to print every politician's message. Editors chose the ones they wanted on their platforms. This led to the rise of other platforms that can help to balance that narrative in of themselves. Why exactly is this very crucial in why we win the debate? The first reason is to talk about what exists on the flip. What happens? Listen, in the vast majority of instances, what states do in status quo is that there is a certain power where governments in themselves have proven to repeatedly gain control over digital speech and use it to protect themselves in status quo. Let me take you through history line. In Uganda, social media was blocked during elections in 2021 because politicians wanted to silence platforms to avoid criticism. In Turkey, till today, they have banned Twitter for people to have access to them. The same thing is happening in India. Government keeps on pressuring the Twitter to remove anti-government posts of themselves. In Pakistan, currently, there is a ban on TikTok, so people cannot have access to TikTok for political context exclusively. In Russia, it's the same thing. It's systematic blocking of platforms and opposition. This means that there is a global pattern that exists that proves that states in themselves have proven over time that they would place a ban on social media companies when they try to rival them. We think in principle, to balance the metric of power that exists, social media companies should have a right to independently deplatform, proving that states in themselves have a unilateral right to independently deplatform them, just like you saw in Nigeria. What happened in 2021? The government, Twitter deleted a post by the President Buhari at the time, because they claimed he was violating the rules on hate speech. What did the Buhari administration of Nigeria do? They responded by banning Twitter nationwide for 7 months, which cost the economy billions, locked people out of having access. People had to use black market systems to have access, which was ridiculously costly and expensive. This means that this shows that oftentimes government punish platforms for moderating politicians, even when the politician is wrong. This means that when you give such government more control, you hand them censorship tools that they already want. Think of it as an intuition. If a government can ban an entire platform just because of one politician's tweet, what will they do when platforms are legally forbidden to moderate politicians? Let's respond to the feeble things that they talk about. Oji, shoot your PI before I proceed.
Your frame of excessive government corruption is harmful to your side too, because in reality, USA has not banned any American-owned social media company. So if the government is so bad in the judiciary, then maybe on your side, they'll buy out all independent company owners anyways. Nothing works.
Yeah, I think you can see how ridiculously intuitively wrong your claim is. The US has not banned any of its own, but it's comfortable to want to do so. It's like other states want to do this if those things exist. So it's not a debate about what the United States would want to do. It's a debate that I beg you to recognize that in places like Uganda, in Nigeria, in Ghana, that these governments can wake up one day and decide to ban these institutions themselves just because they don't think they give them a certain level of power and authority. Let's respond to the feeble things they talk about. The first is their model. They say we want judicial inclusion because they claim that state structures like the courts should determine which of these contents should exist. There are 3 responses. The first is judicial inclusion is not a solution to the abusive power narrative of social media companies that they talk about. Because regardless of the amount of judicial inclusion you don't change that power, that structure that they say exists. But secondly, over the years, just like I proved in the previous analogy, state power has proven to be just as biased as their claim to always want to favor specific sides, which means when you include judiciary, you automatically extend states more power to control what they want to be on the media, which means that they can comfortably outrival competitors, people that want to critique their government, shut down opposition parties, control this media to ensure that only the narratives they want exist on their side of the house. The last thing is that I don't think that the fact that people would not want to engage with the alternative because nobody watches television or read newspaper is enough reason for you to be blind to the fact that other media alternatives exist for these guys to exist and have their platforms. Look at the both sides. If you agree that social media have power ridiculously, and you agree that state has ridiculous amount of power. Ask yourself which is worse, given the monopoly of power structure that exists. Proud to propose.
All right, thank you very much to Dio for the fine speech. This closed the opening half of the debate. Now going to the closing half, I would like to invite the member of government here. Inviting the member of government to begin.
Yeah. Can you guys hear me?
Yep, loud and clear. Ready when you are.
Yes. Can you guys hear me? I'm sorry. Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
All right, great. Give me a second. All right. Um, I'm at work, so I'll be speaking very undertone, but I think this is quite fine so that we have a wonderful conversation. I'm going to start let me see the people on the call first. Wow, there are a lot of people here. Vacations pass. You guys should join the vacations pass group. Also, there's a website. Kindly click on it and help your boy Super Nana achieve his dream. I think this is the only sensible thing he has done. And as a friend, I'm supposed to support him. So yeah, kindly support him. I think that's the only sensible thing you hear from him because the speech was not as sensible as what I'm about to give, anyways. Yeah. Starting the speech in 3, 2, 1. Opening opposition loses the debate largely. A couple of things. Because O says politicians have overwhelming power. Hence, media should check them because they are the only non-state actors that checks them. Our extension and framing will show you why they do not achieve that. And this is going to do two things strategically in terms of the meta and the debate. A, that the framing will outweigh opening government, and that's why opening government is going to lose to us. But secondly, it's also going to neutralize the claims and the impact I get from opening opposition, and that's why opening opposition is also going to lose to us. But just to quickly frame the debate in a way that makes sense, we think that no team in the opening half analyzes what the life looks like after you ban this thing, because notice that the motion says that this is social media, like people or whatever, groups or whatever, independently banned. It means that in a world where independently deplatform these people, it means that in a world where they don't get the chance to independently deplatform these people, two things will likely occur. A, that there's most likely going to be a social media versus state collaboration where probably they form an oversight committee where probably they look at which politicians deserve to be deplatformed, all those other stuff within most of those instances to come to a consensus to, let's say, we are deplatforming one politician. That's one faction of it. Why is that faction, which is comparatively better on our side as compared to giving the overwhelming power to one social media to act? Because if the conversation is that most of these social media people are also very terrible people, they have incentive, all those other stuff, it means that insofar as we have the state, which also have their incentive versus the social media that have their incentive, it means even if any entity wants to lobby them to probably protect these politicians and all those stuff, there is that clash of incentive, which means that they will most likely reach a consensus. And that consensus is most likely not going to be targeting and polarizing. So it means that the politicians that overwhelmingly deserve to be the platform are the ones that are proportionally the platform, and you don't get that targeting and every other thing that happens on that side. Comparatively, we think it's better as compared to independently giving the power to social media actors to comparatively target some people to deplatform them to destabilize the democracy that exists on our side. So that even on that one comparative, we show why lobbying is particularly difficult, and that means that the outcome of most of these deplatforming, even if the platforming is going to happen on our side of the house, is one that's comparatively better as compared to up. so they lose. Secondly, let's even assume that state does not do anything. There's no effectiveness on our world. Everyone can see whatever they want on social media and they are not punished. Why do we think our world is comparatively better? Three things of analysis. A, because notice that social media in of itself inherently comes to things like fact checking and all those other stuff, which means that inherently status quo is massively mitigating in a way that you don't have any tipping point to give an overwhelming power asymmetry to one entity to control most of these, like the way in which interactions happen within this state, within this media in the first place. That means that they lose on that comparative. But secondly, notice that even if like there are radical people, populists that exist on that side, the fact that you have ideological divide in status quo and you cannot prove which ideology is much more moral or much more morally like weightier than the other means that there's always balancing perspective within most of those sides. What this means is that most times there is that neutralization of whatever perspective that happens. But secondly, I think the of up tells you that most of the social media want clicks and all those other stuff. So the way in which it happens is that they push a lot of the information from different spheres for most of those things to exist, which means that there is that balancing that exists to create that checking mechanism already. So if Trump is being massively conservative, there's probably someone who's also massively liberal, which neutralizes the extent of harm and everything that they claim on their side.
POI.
Which then also means that they then don't have any overarching necessity or tipping point to see something is happening so massively in status quo that we need to overwhelmingly give social media that power in order for them to act. They don't prove any tipping point. They don't prove any necessity. We prove that in our world where even in the outcome of all those two things, why we are comparatively better than opening up their out. Now the extension proper. Notice, and this is where we are going to beat them. First of
Point
all,
of information.
I think Alia will take you, but then let me see if I can take you later. How do private social media operate? And this is where the extension proper starts. Listen carefully. First of all, most of them are capitalistic. I think you've heard most of this, but no one takes the pain to show you how they run as a capitalistic model. Most of these entities operate on things like the break-even model. So most times they are funded by venture capitalists, all those other stuff for like 5 to 10 years before they break even and start making profit and all those other stuff. It means that most of them, like as I said, are funded by venture capitalists. That means there's direct incentive for profit. But secondly, most venture capitalists also use those platforms to engineer narratives that do two things. A, make the politicians they support and lobby very popular in order to keep them in power and to keep their capitalistic power. So things like for them to evade taxes, for them to entrench their monopoly to get much more money, all those other stuff. But secondly, to make opposing political parties unpopular so that most times they are able to win most of those elections. Case in point, you have Democrats versus liberal channels in the United States where they push them like ideologies over the other ideology and all this other stuff that happens. But the reason why particularly they target the media.
Speaker, be brave.
What do you mean by that? What is your POI? What sensible thing do you have to
Take up
say?
your eye.
Yeah, shoot
Okay.
your POI.
Would you have, okay, what then would you have preferred, like any social media platform
Yeah,
do
yeah, yeah, yeah.
in
I
light
think
of Donald Trump going ahead and inciting mass violence in the States? What would
like
you have
I
done?
think I think it's just 15 seconds. I think you were not listening to majority of the things that I said in my first speech, and that's an inherent problem. I think you have to deal with your own. You see, the problem is that most times media shapes things like agenda setting power, coercive power, all those other stuff, and most of these people are the ones that use that narrative. The last thing and most important thing that you need to note is that the comparative is not that these people are the platform, they can't do anything. The comparative is that most times, most of the people that get the platform that are very radical people that have money, so then Trump and all those other people, most of them have power to create overwhelmingly huge alternative media like Truth Social and all those other stuff. It means that open opposition biggest case to say, oh, you will not incite capital, all those other stuff, because they are loyalist fans that will go down to go and them dismantle things and all those other stuff will still follow them to Truth Social, go and listen to the terrible things that they have to say within most of those instances. And most times they still go and do the very terrible thing Pinelle tells you. Comparative on our side is that on our side where there is free speech, there's the balancing of all those things. So if you have Trump actively engineering his people constantly also interact with liberal spaces. The discourse that's creation of itself means that you're able to organically engineer them into spaces where you decrease the extent at which you are most likely going to be radical to do all those harmful things that they claim on their side of the house. Their harm solves nothing on their side, and the deplatforming just worsens whatever happens on their side. It's on our side where we are able to create massive organic change through the massive contact theory that we provide. No one is able to create organic change except closing governments here.
All right, thank you very much to the member of GAF for the fine speech. Now inviting member of here.
Okay. I want to confirm. I want to confirm if I'm audible.
Yep, loud and clear, ready when you are.
Okay, so if you have a POI, I kindly request you wait, like you ask the POI before you. Sorry, I'll ask for it. That's what I mean. Then I will take you at my own pace. Shout out to my beautiful partner for throwing me some insights. I genuinely had nothing, still do have nothing, but yeah. Let's cook. I'm going to start specifically on my next word. So I'm going to agree with Eziel that this is going to remain a closing half debate. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to deal with opening government. Cherica will respond to most of Eziel and CG's extension as a whole. Then I'm going to show you why we beat opening up as well. Let's start with opening government. Opening government has a bizarre case. Their case says that they want to utilize that these individuals utilize guidelines for their own benefit, and they use them to oppress people. They never mechanize why. They said they use it to throw out people. It is the same thing Eziel says in extension, but that's fine. The debate you have there's no mechanism to explain why this is true or how it happens. But secondly, even if it was true, I'm gonna explain in extension why that probably becomes better. But I think the first thing to mitigate both the cases from OG and CG is to show you why they less likely do this. The first is the image, right? Social media thrives on numbers. The more numbers they get, the more money they make, and the more individuals are able to participate. The reason why this becomes important then is that they care about their perception. It means they don't want to specifically look weird or biased in that particular regard. I think at the end of the day, they are most likely still not going to do anything as just haphazardly just pick out anybody and throw them out just because some politician says that it is okay to do so. But even if that is the case, and like you would want to buy into Eziel's impact on loyalists existing in that particular regard, I think loyalists are not part of the discussion. This is why this is true. Whether you ban or not, loyalists don't change. Whether you chase him off the platform or keep him there, you're not going to change them. You're not going to make them convert. They are so deep within the belief system that they are not going to be willing to convert. They are more likely going to just cause more ruckus on the social media platform, like opening or probably tells you, but in a shallow way, which I'll go deeper into. The next thing they talk about is on the idea as to why or we think politicians should be able to speak. I think this is why our case is going to be important, because the people they provide are harmful. I think opening up still sufficiently beats them on that particular regard. But also, again, these guys said that, and this is why I think the first extension is going to do on context, specifically deal with opening government's case. This is positive matter, but it's going to respond to what these guys say. And this is something opening opposition does not give you. The process under which judicial appeal happens in that particular regard. Judiciary doesn't just haphazardly follows laws. Most of the guidelines that social media platforms give you are based off and stem from the specific laws that judiciary uses on to like provide justice. So things like freedom of speech, the range, if you read on the general comments on like freedom of expression and freedom of to express yourself and your views, all these things delve into those specific things. Social media platforms are not one person working behind a computer. They have a team of legal experts. They have a team of like researchers that build these specific laws to ensure that they are able to create guidelines that also like uphold the law, but also ensure that individuals are probably safe in those particular spaces. What it means is that even if you go to court, you're still going to be using guidelines that are stemming from the very laws you're going to use to find justice. It means the courts also rely on the guidelines to deliver justice. So if you say social media platforms are bad, unlucky for you, they're still going to use those specific metrics you are opposing to deliver justice. That means the alternative on opening government is logically inconsistent, but also for them to get their case, you have to still buy into our case that social media platforms are actually good actors in the first place. To begin with, DPM is ridiculous. He says then that people like Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton aren't banned because they are most of a threat. These are the brains of the Democratic Party. They're the brains that direct what Kamala Harris should say, what Kamala Harris's policies should look like when they are pitching on public debates. It's unclear to me why you wouldn't then cancel these individuals if they are the bigger threat and that they're the ones that groom and make the threats that you say are a threat on social media that you should probably not, that you should probably ban in that particular regard. It's unclear to me why at the end of the day that becomes an issue and contentious in the debate. What does this specific POI and what did it prove to you at the end of the day? It means then that at the end of the day, proving and like the idea of banning these individuals in of themselves never ideally preaches to solvency of the specific problem. They only argue to you why it should be justified. They never argue how it solves the problem. They say that, oh, we're going to just ban individuals. Elon Musk is bad and is going to just handpick individuals. No, there's a spectrum and a guideline one under which they do. But there is no smoke without fire. It means there's an extent of harm that has been caused onto these individuals, an extent on legal violations and like constitutional statutory violations that you have implemented to ensure that those harms specifically happen. It means the legitimacy case on their side is lost because we proved to you that under these specific processes, the action is innately legitimate in of itself. That means they actually lose that particular debate on their side. Even if that was true, judiciary, the things that they say that can be done by the judiciary, if they're relying on it, we can also rely on it to probably undo the specific things that they say are unfair. That's why courts exist for appeals and all those particular regards. We can still co-opt those benefits that particular regard. They say we should radicalize these individuals. They say deplatforming is something which the people are people are going to be radical on our side of the debate in that particular regard. I think you are more radical on your side of the debate when you use people with more shocking charisma and rhetoric. What's our extension? I think the first extension was on positive matter on what the process actually looks like. The problem on opening up cases that they talk about safety. Why does opening opposition lose? I think, and we need to be very honest and charitable here. I think Mascot's speech is very counterintuitive to his own case. Why? He says then that itself that these people have too much power to probably be able to check and control and probably bully these specific social media systems. It means his speech says that these things are specifically ineffective. It's counterintuitive to what Pinelle says. I think Pinelle's case is what you should probably credit more. I don't think there's much to add much to the debate. What's our extension then? But before that, I'm gonna want to have a chat with opening government.
You're going to lose because you agree that we can force the judicial appeals to happen, but on your side, you can't force a private company to change who they are targeting. Even if they are corrupt, we can change with democracy. What do you do?
Yeah, this is the problem. Even when you go to court, they're still going to interrogate the specific guidelines you're saying are unfair. What I'm telling you is that those guidelines don't exist in a vacuum. They are legal people, they are legal consultants, they are researchers. There is a legitimate spectrum on this. The first extension was on how the process looks like. The second extension is going to be very different. It's contextual in nature. Why does this why does this independent counseling exist in the first place? It's because the laws are lagging. The judicial system has been lagging behind with a fast evolving social media platform, fast evolving group of individuals. They've been evolving fast and the law has been struggling to keep up. Fortunately for them, social media has been able to keep up because they also have legal consultants. They have researchers who advise on the best course of action to carry out. That's why they've been canceling these individuals. Because of populistic leaders that don't have proper manifestos, they use shocking charisma and rhetoric to probably rally up individuals and create inherent harm on those specific things. We say that those individuals need to be taken off social media to talk about scalable harm. We beat opening opposition because of this. The comparative I'm giving you. The scale of harm that exists on their side on government is far larger than on our side of the debate because there are more people you can manipulate, there are more people you can convert, there are more people you can probably use the shocking charisma because not everybody is educated, not everybody is rational, not everybody is going to approach politics on rational lines anyways. We beat the debate on opening half because we break that deadlock on how we create but we beat closing up because we show you why the process in itself is for all to talk about and why that this action is legitimate in of itself. We are proud to win from opening opposition.
All right, thank you very much to the member of opposition for the fine speech. Now to close the entirety of Gov Bench, I would like to invite the government whip here.
Hello, can I be heard?
It was a little bit soft. Can you speak a bit louder or nearer to the mic?
Is it better now?
Oh yeah, much better.
Just give me a second. This better. Okay, this is. All right. If you have a POI, just unmute. All right.
I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. You get 3 extensions from Eziel. The first one is on framing, and then the second one is an analytical extension, and the third one is a main extension that you get. The first extension that talks about is on frame. He explains to you how exactly this debate exists in the first place. This debate does not exist in a context where the democracy is not a good democracy. The reason why that's true is because all the examples that Mascot gives you are basically examples in countries that democracies do not exist. The reason why Pakistan is able to just ban TikTok anyhow or Twitter anyhow is because their democracies are not like well established. So in those type of countries, there is no question of banning an individual because they're capable of banning a whole social media platform in the first place. So we do not think that that's basically something that we can debate on, right? But then the second reason why this framing is very, very important is that also places us over opening government. Because if they had made that clarification, this base opening opposition would not have run that in the first place, right? But then the second very important frame that he gives you is when he explains to you how the selective targeting happens on social media by these platforms, and he also gives you the reason why this selective targeting happens. He explains to you how these capitalists are not like good people in nature, right? Because at the end of the day, they show you why they're very, very dependent on politicians and why they have incentives to, at the end of the day, want to support one political party. Even though Pinelle says, which is opening opposition, even though they say that they're independent, right? And they have no incentive. Eziel gives you those incentives, which is like to be able to evade taxes properly or to be able to have contracts with the government that will enable them to get more money at the end of the day, right? This basically takes out opening opposition's whole case of how like these guys are most likely like
POI.
capitalists, and so most likely these people are independent, and so they have no incentive to connect with one side. We've shown you why they have an incentive to connect with one side, because that one side, when it comes into power, is going to give them those benefits that they want. I'll take you when I'm ready. I've heard you. All right, so that's the first reason why opening opposition fails. But the second reason why they fail is that their main case is that they're volatile messages. The problem with that is that, as Eziel tells you, then that's his main case, that morality is not like objective. It's very, very subjective, which means that we cannot now come and say that this is the right thing or this is the wrong thing, right? And what this means is that something that is volatile in your mind might not necessarily be volatile in terms of like the in terms of a larger scale, right? Or if your ideology is most likely is differs from other person, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the most worst thing. But at a point in time where it gets to treason, that's where the whole conversation gets to like probably deplatforming somebody, right? But then once again, he's able to show you why that legitimacy does not should not exist in the hands of the platforms themselves. And then the reason why he said, and the reason that he gives is not that you should depend on the government. He tells you how deplatforming them by these platforms themselves is even worse off. And this is also the second extension that he gives when he tells you that there's a huge likelihood of these rich politicians that are probably giving out radical information is that they're going to form their own platforms, which is still going to create the echo chambers that opening opposition does not want to create, right? What this means is that at the end of the day, if you don't take an action of banning, the deplatforming of these people is going to create more harm than good. And that also responds to closing opposition's whole case of how does the situation now become better through the harm. Even if it doesn't become better, at least we prevent the harm that happens from deplatforming, right? But then let's come to closing opposition, because they're very funny, right? They say that the court is going to rely on the guidelines. That's literally what we're trying to say, that we want those guidelines to be used. We don't want somebody to just like decide that this person does not match my ideologies, and so at the end of the day we don't want them on this platform. The problem is that they are not following the guidelines, and there is no guideline on social
You're
media
right.
that says that if this person says A, B, or C, they should be taken out of the platform. There are so many other good alternatives that we talk about. There can be censoring, there can be like probably maybe freezing of their platform for some time. But the entirely deplatforming is something very, very radical that takes away that person's like choice in the first place, right? We think that's something very, very extreme. There was a huge burden on opposition to show the overwhelming harm that only this individual that is being deplatformed is doing, to be able to just take them off. But then two, there was also a huge burden to show why these social media platforms are most likely not going to be selective in their action of deplatforming. None of the teams have done that. I'll take opening opposition.
All right. So your response to the fact that most of the country examples I used are not democratic is uncharitable, given that I also mentioned the ones that are democratic. But lastly, none of you have responded on why you have a right to ban an institution that has a constitutional and economic right to decide what exists on their platform.
All right. So there can be a lot of democracies, but they don't really work properly. The Pakistan is a democracy, but we literally know that no other political party has a say, right? We're talking about proper democracies that do not have the capability of just banning an entire social media platform. But on the second part, right, we think that freedom of speech of these specific platforms, and I think you already get this from Johnson's speech, right? Because he tells you how freedom of speech actually comes under the Constitution itself. So at a point in time where you are threatening, at a point in time where your action goes against the government or against the rule of law in the first place, then the government does have the right to ban those certain actions. We've systematically proven to you why this legitimacy of them removing these people does not, it causes more harm because it creates more echo chambers. But then two, that idea of being able to now the social media platforms now deciding what is moral and what is not moral, and then deciding the ideologies and morality itself, is something that is extremely harmful to the whole idea of democracy in and of itself. And that is why that constitutional right that these social media platforms have is taken away at that very point in time. And that's why that freedom of choice of these social media platforms does not necessarily exist, right? I think that to a large extent, then I've been able to respond to opening opposition and closing opposition. And I've probably weighed their arguments as well, because the main argument that you get from both opposition side is that, well, there is harm happening. Two responses that you get from Eziel already is that the harm that's happening, one is we cannot decide whether that's actually the whatever the harm that happens is one-sided, or they don't prove why that harm that's happening is something that will the banning that is going to be done, or deplatforming that is going to be done, is going to be neutral at the end of the day. That was a burden on them to prove, right? But the reason why we think that we are better than opening government is that we prove a lot of things, as in they only say that it makes social media exploitation very easy, but they not necessarily prove why that connection between capitalists and politicians exists. That's something that you uniquely get from Eziel, which was very crucial to the analysis that you get from opening government. Extremely proud to propose.
All right, thank you very much to Gafwith for the fine speech. Now, to conclude the entirety of this master's round, I would like to invite the opposition whip. Here.
Damn, my partner is off again. Let's see if she's on.
Oh, okay. Do try and get her back into the line. Try and contact her or something. Thank you.
Me and Eziel agree that the top. So me and Eziel agree that the top half is out of the debate. Let me show you how. Let's start with opening government. And like we said in member, opening government never ideally proves how their banning is ideally going to eradicate the problem. Their case is predicated on the fact that the people who they are removing are ideally bad, ideally people who are not guilty of anything. The crux of the closing opposition extension is to prove the legitimacy of the action. We're not simply waking up in the morning and saying we are going to cancel politician X because we want to. It's because there is a range of things they have done. Pinelle brilliantly cites this out for you by telling you that Donald Trump was able to make a tweet that was able to incite violence to the extent that the Capitol was attacked. Whenever people like Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton write stuff critiquing the Republican government or critiquing Donald Trump for what he has done, they aren't removed from Twitter. They aren't cancelled. They aren't deplatformed. So that means that the entire argument of that
you are in power and you are selectively taking out specific individuals isn't bad. And this is based off the more realistic and proximate context from closing government of the context under which this country, or the context of countries under which these scenarios should most likely occur. But opening government assumes that this debate also happens in countries like Uganda. Let's take them on. I think even when their biggest opposition, i.e. the NUP, even when the biggest opposition in Nigeria is existing in that particular regard, even in Ghana, you don't see these political parties being able to like cancel these political parties influencing Twitter or the individuals there to like cancel and deplatform the opposition members of that political party. Hell, it's freaking impossible because at the end of the day, you're not going to do it because those platforms, one, care about their image, two, won't just stupidly do it because they know of the image and the backlash it causes. We argue that that point, that case is basically theoretically assumptuous because they're not able to give you mechanisms on how this works. Why were the mechanisms important in the debate? It's a freaking policy motion. You have to explain to us how the harm exists, why it exists, but also how it exists for you to explain why your policy ideally gets to solve that particular problem. The model thus far is presumptuous because it doesn't ideally show you why the harm most likely exists. But even if we did, we show you how, one, we mitigate those specific harms. Secondly, why those things don't ideally solve the problem. Opening government speech becomes out in that particular regard. But there's a beautiful extension from member of OP about how the process exists in of itself. The process under how the guidelines are shaped. That information was so crucial for the debate because the same things they want to rely on to seek justice on opening government side are the same things that the media platforms rely on to create these guidelines. By extension, the reference to getting justice also in line with the guidelines, because when you go to court, they're going to ask you, did you violate the guidelines that you probably signed on terms and conditions when you were setting up this account? Yes, you did violate those specific terms. So at the end of the day, you really don't have a fighting chance even when you pursue the judiciary. We prove legitimacy on opening on closing up, and it sufficiently takes out the delusional opening government case. What does Supanana tell you? He assumes that the biggest threat of the Democratic Party is Kamala Harris, and we ask, well, why isn't the bigger threat, which is Barack Obama, people like Sleepy Joe that are able to mentor these individuals, show them how the manifesto should be shaped, show them the particular ways they should break down their opposition? Why are those people's accounts being taken down? Why wasn't George Bush's account taken down? Why wasn't Matt Shomi's account taken down? If those were if you're talking about a bigger threat to specific opposition, they weren't. Based off the fact that you are having a political party, you're being thrown out or being deplatformed because you are causing significant harm. We prove that case. Opening operation goes as far as to explain the duty and the necessity for safety. They never explain the process and the legitimacy under which this action happened. This is exclusive of closing operation, and we take the credit for that. Just because they flag safety just doesn't mean they win the debate, because we can show you ultimately achieve that particular regard. Eziel, I'm coming. Hold up. The next thing they talk about on the idea is so the idea of, we think that crimes are that abuse of power is going to happen on that particular regard. And this is where Mascot's case is self-defeating. He spends the vast bulk of his DLO speech explaining why these governments are too big to be checked and too big to be controlled. So all the impacts they provide to you on accountability and safety may less likely be able to be achieved because Mascot's speech is able to shaft the LO speech on proving safety. If the states are too big to be checked, where the hell is the safety? Here's the exclusive impact we provide you on our side of the debate. At least when we take out these individuals and deplatform them from the platforms when they cause a lot of chaos, we force them to restructure how they approach politics, how they reapproach discourse, how they reapproach public debates, how they reapproach how they appeal to individuals, so that they aren't defaming, so that they aren't being abusive, they aren't violating guidelines. That way they're able to play by the rules and win the sympathy of the public, even when they're being oppressed by the major political parties. The sympathy allows individuals to horrible political parties for who they are, and the political parties lose popularity. So even if CG and OG's case is true, on principle, we are able to message and symbolically show that these individuals are oppressors and don't value free speech. On the side of the debate, we buy sympathy. This is an exclusive benefit you never get on opening opposition with their case riddled with inconsistencies and shafting, but also outweighs and flips the case on their side on opening and closing government's case altogether. Before I move into what CG's case is, more plausible case of the debate, Eziel, go.
Here is why they don't get their reapproach and symbolic everything that they say, because we should actually prove why if you deplatform them, these people have capacity to create alternative that which worsens the polarization, which causes more of their fans to do terrible things that threatens the state sustainability itself. So you don't get to a point where you're able to get organic change through things like this because of the echo chamber they uniquely create and lock all other people that don't subscribe to them out.
I get you. But that's a very smart idea. I actually agree with the idea, but we made a response to that already, which is a very simple response, which was, and you make the mechanism that is more likely. The more likely thing is that when Trump makes his own media platform, only the people who support him and are loyal to him get to go there. How many people are on the trust platform? Even if they were able to make their own alternative platforms, how many individuals are going to just make the radical shift? People don't just download platforms for vibes because they want to. It's simply because they believe these platforms are meaningful to them. If they have no use for it, they won't go. But the loyalists aren't the most important actors in the debate, because whether this debate exists or not, whether you deplatform someone or not, the loyalists will still remain loyal to Trump. That delta is on the amount of individuals that Trump influences with his rhetoric, his propaganda, and his lies. Those individuals are the ones who are less likely going to be influenced if it doesn't exist on the platform anyways. That's the delta you're looking for in the debate. The scale of harm, scalable harm on the side of the debate. What does CO win the debate? We beat opening government, opening up because we are more consistent. But secondly, we are able to show you how we ideally solve the problem on our side and the margins. Something that we're going to be able to beat with opening government. Opening government's case is presumptuous. Show you why it leads to more harm, but also we solve the problem better. See, this case is more proximate, but it never proves to you why they are less likely going to solve the problems. Listen, policy motions are ideally about how you ideally solve the problem, not just about flagging injustice and justification. To be a philosophical debate. We think we solve the problem better. The necessity we are proud to win from closing up.
All right. Thank you very much to the opposition whip for the fine speech. This concludes the entirety of this master's round. You may all virtually cross floors